Hi, everyone. I'm LeAnne Lagasse. It is really so good to be here. Michelle and Janelle at EarlyEngage and Sam are just some of my very favorite people. And so I encourage you to check them out. We are going to talk about something that is always sort of at the forefront of our mind, but it's not often that we kind of just will spend an hour or so like exploring it in this, kind of format. But it's one of my favorite things to talk about because what I have found over the years is that, everybody goes to work riding a roller coaster of sorts, right? You experience just wonderful highs with the people that you work with. Hopefully you have great collaboration and communication. You probably have some people that you work with that you just feel incredibly close to and connected to, or have a really great, positive working relationship. But the reality is that working with others is also hard work, right? It is a challenge to figure out how to navigate different personalities and different, tendencies, and figure out how to get to the outcomes that we need and we want. Working with others is really hard work. And I think we underestimate exactly how hard that it is. I mean, you think about maybe what it is like to communicate on a regular basis with your spouse or your partner or your kids, or even your close friends. And then you think about, all of those things, those relational challenges that you have also happen in the workplace. So why do we not spend as much time talking about it? So that's what we're going to do today. I want to just start by giving you a couple of evidences of what I've just shared sort of anecdotally. So one of the services that I provide is helping organizations assess employee engagement and really just get a sense of how employees feel about working at the organization. And it is without a doubt almost always the case that the engagement drivers that assess things like my team, my colleagues, my manager, or our communication are often among the lowest scores for the clients that I serve. I mean, that is, I've seen that across industry and across organizations of all size, right? Organizations of different tenure. And so it's difficult to work with people. Here's another large study that was conducted pretty recently that determined over 1/3 of employees self-reported having experienced some kind of difficult interpersonal conflict. Either it was an isolated conflict or a difficult ongoing relationship just within the past year. I actually thought that number was a little bit low. I don't know if you felt that way or not when you saw it, but at least over 1/3 of us, I should say, statistically have experienced some kind of tough or challenging relationship. And then for my managers in the room, there was a study on a time analysis study that was conducted that determined that the typical people manager spends 25% on the low end to 40% on a high end of their time dealing with workplace conflicts directly, or more so even than that, the implications of workplace conflicts in terms of lost, productivity and efficiency and collaboration and all that good stuff. So that would work out to about 1 to 2 days of every work week, again, on the high end of that. And so, we know the research bears this out that interpersonal conflicts are going to happen in the workplace. We're going to interact with people that we find challenging. So what I want to do today is really talk about a couple of strategies that you can use to navigate some of those challenging relationships. And just real quick, I want to let you know that's kind of where I come in. My background is in higher education. I was a professor at Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas for 14 years. I served as the director of public speaking there, and I taught pretty much every course in the curriculum. And then in 2017, I launched a workplace consulting and training company that really focused on employee engagement and retention. And so that's the work that I do full time now. I help organizations improve engagement, retention, and equip their people managers. I'm also clearly an early engage facilitator and just very passionate about the work that Michelle and Janelle and their team do to serve organizations in this particular area. So that's a little bit about me. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about how you can search for and identify some root causes of challenging behavior, how you can apply some communication and management strategies to prevent challenging behavior, because that's the key. And then when you need to have tough performance management conversations, how do we navigate those effectively? So that's the plan. All right. Skill number one in navigating challenging relationships. This one always throws people just a little bit for a loop. Or like, wait a minute, this kind of kind of threw that one at me. It's not really about the challenging person. It's about me. But here's the deal. We can't control the behavior of other people. And we all know that intuitively, and kind of anecdotally, but we can't control other people. We can, however, control how we respond to the people in our lives that are challenging. And so skill number one, without a doubt, is starting with our own self-awareness and self-management. And so I wanted to ask you a quick question. And so Sam, you can sort of launch the poll if you'd like. The poll here is, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being, I'm extremely self-aware, and 1 being, okay, I'm extremely unself-aware, where would you rank yourself in terms of your own self-awareness? And so I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes or a minute or so to see that come in. Okay, so we're seeing like a range of 5 to 9 so far. So when we end the poll, we'll kind of see how it shakes out. The reason that I asked this question is because we all kind of come to the table with varying degrees of awareness of our own strengths and weaknesses and our own tendencies. But it's really important, not that we just sort of have labeled ourselves with a number, but really it's important that we're thinking about how other people perceive us, as self-aware. So, okay, I think let's go ahead and end because it looks like we've got a lot coming in. Okay, so let's share results. So it looks like, okay, the majority of us, 28% are saying 7, 8, we got a couple, 5 or 6, nobody said under 5. So that's good. That's good news. Although I would argue that if you come to a session like this, in which you're thinking about working with challenging people, you're probably a person who cares a lot about this. And nobody said a 10. Right. So a couple of us said, 9, that we do feel like we're pretty self-aware. So thanks for participating. The reason I ask is because, and this isn't to throw you for another loop, but the reason I ask is because what the research says about self-awareness is that we are actually generally much less self-aware than we think we are. In fact, there is a cognitive bias called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which states, and it's not applied only to self-awareness, but to a lot of different things. For example, communication or leadership skill or strategic thinking skill. But the idea here, this cognitive bias says that we tend to overestimate our own abilities. We self-report our own skills much higher than what the kind of collective peer average would be for us in that particular area. So in other words, if we think we are, and if you put, okay, I think I'm a 7 on self-awareness, statistically, if you were to fall in line exactly the way that the research kind of predicts, what that would mean is that a collective group of your peers, your spouse, your kiddos, your coworkers, leaders you've had in the past, right? The collective average would actually typically rank us lower on whatever skill that is than we would rank ourselves. Because in an organization, most people rate themselves somewhere between a 6 and an 8 or a 9 on self-awareness. But when colleagues are asked to rate others on self-awareness, it's usually more like a 3 to a 5, right? Now, that's not to say that's the case for you, but more just to educate you that we tend to overestimate our own abilities in this area. In fact, you would think that as a leader climbs the ladder in his or her organization, that they would become more self-aware because they've got more experience and maybe they've gotten, they've learned through and grown through a lot of their weaknesses over time. But what the research shows is that statistically, the higher we climb in an organization, actually the less self-aware we become. And so I don't know if anybody has any ideas you want to throw kind of in the chat, ideas that you have as to maybe why we would typically decrease in self-awareness as we grow in our leadership. When I ask this in face-to-face settings, people always get a little anxious. Okay, Bobby says we become insulated from feedback. Absolutely. So the higher you were 70% more likely to employ large numbers of unself-aware employees. Again, that's the self-report data versus the other report data. So when it comes to dealing with challenging people, we always have to look inward first. And that's hard because emotions run high, and we may find ourselves dealing with the same issue over and over and over again, whether it's someone we're leading or somebody that that's a colleague. But we have to absolutely start first, slow down, and ask ourselves some important questions, because people and leaders with high social and emotional intelligence, they have self-awareness, right? And they're consistently curious about how they are affecting people. But that self-awareness doesn't stop there, right? Because you could have someone who's self-aware, but doesn't actually do anything with that awareness. What really leads to powerful interpersonal outcomes and communication outcomes is when you allow that self-awareness to fuel self-expression, which is how we talk about our own talent and our own tendencies and our own strengths and weaknesses and preferences and all of that stuff. And then the self-expression leads to better self-regulation, right? And what I mean by self-regulation is our ability to adjust or to dial up or dial down our strengths, or to dial our tendencies, our preferences, to really accommodate the needs of the room. What do the people around us need from us to really thrive and flourish, or to, accomplish this project or whatever it is? So that's the goal for us, is that self-awareness leads to self-expression, which leads to self-regulation. So you, excuse me, so you also want to look inward first and ask yourself some of these questions. Number one is, okay, what am I feeling? And what's underneath these feelings when I'm dealing with a person who is really challenging to me? What am I feeling? What's underneath those feelings? This is a question that's hard for some people to answer and easier for others. When I coach leaders, and especially when I'm coaching them through challenging relationships, I will often stop and ask them, well, what is that making you feel, or what's that making you think? And you'd be surprised, or maybe not, how hard that question is for some people to answer. I'll give you an example. I was recently brought in to help with an organization where there are two individuals who are really struggling to get along. They are both really high performers, and they're both very crucial to the team. They have, in some ways, a really interesting setup at their organization, but one of those people the female in this story has been there a really long time, and the male that they're having a challenging relationship has not been there quite as long, but has a really confident and assertive demeanor, walks into a room and sort of just feels very confident, and has a really positive working relationship with almost everybody in the organization. But for some reason, these two have really struggled to work together productively. So I'm having conversations in this case with just the female leader at the time. And I kept asking her, what she was feeling. And she kept saying, things like, well, he's doing this and he's doing this and he's mad. He's frustrating me this way. And then he did this and then he said this. And she kept sort of just wanting to talk about the things that he did, as if to, justify to me, which she didn't need to do, that these things were challenging and frustrating. And finally, I said, no. Okay, don't tell me what he did. Tell me what you felt. And she paused for, I think it's probably a good 20 seconds. And then she said, he makes me feel really small. And when she said that, it was a light bulb, kind of an aha moment for her, that she hadn't really acknowledged the way that particular behavior was affecting her. And so she was so angry and so focused on the outcome of his actions and his communication, his behavior, that she wasn't looking inward to figure out, well, what's underneath these feelings? Okay, so he is make me, or something he's doing is resulting in me feeling very, very small, right? So ask yourself, when you have to pause and ask yourself and use that self-control to go, okay, what is it that I'm feeling? Where in my body am I feeling it? That's another really good question to ask yourself. What's underneath these feelings? Which expectations do I have? Which values do I have? Which personal convictions do I have that have been offended here? I'll give you another example of that. I had a client a couple years ago who was a very, very empathetic leader. And if you had to say like what his kind of core value was, it would be, compassion and empathy, and his team feeling like they belonged. And he had a co-founder that he was working with at the time that was very much kind of a justice person, like the value was justice and consistency, and from his perspective, fairness. And so you can imagine that they struggled a little bit because they're underneath this challenging behavior that they were interpreting the other person had was a core value that they felt was being offended, or that a conviction that they had, an expectation that they had for how things might go in their organization. Underneath it was something that they felt very personal about. And so this piece is super crucial to the puzzle, is to go, okay, what feels violated? What feels offended? What expectations do I have that have not been met? Whether spoken or unspoken, they still are expectations that we have. Bobby, I love that you said, self-awareness is the ultimate form of vulnerability. And we do, as humans, spend a lot of energy avoiding vulnerability. So taking the time to stop and ask this question is crucial. Everybody's favorite question, as it turns out, how might I have contributed to this becoming an issue? And what can I own? So I'll give you another example of this. I had another client I was having a conversation with, and she had sort of a similar situation to the first example I shared about, the just tough relationship that she had at work, and she didn't feel very respected in her role. And so I asked her, okay, let's think through how you might have contributed to this becoming an issue. And she paused again, and she said, when we first started working together, this person came in with so much experience and so much perceived, credibility, and I was very intimidated. And early on, I know that I did not assert myself very much in those initial conversations, those meetings, to sort of establish my credibility and my position and my, what matters to me. And so I was just silent over time. And so in that way, I contributed to this becoming an issue. That's not to excuse the behavior from the other person that was troublesome, but just to say that what is it that I can own, and how have I potentially contributed to this becoming an issue? Now, you may ask this question and authentically say, actually, as it turns out, I did not contribute to this issue. And that's okay too. But the point is to stop and to ask yourself the question. And then another favorite question, is it possible I am also a challenging person, right? To consider the ways that we tend to overestimate our own ratings of ourselves in leadership skill or communication or collaboration skill or whatever it is, right? Self-awareness. That is it possible that we are not seeing the impact that we're having on other people? So before we can really turn and start thinking about the challenging person that we're dealing with, it's worth considering if it's possible that we are, in fact, a challenging person too. Okay, which leads me to skill number 2, which is, again, kind of the self-awareness piece of this is an on-ramp for skill number 2, which is mining for the talent and the tendency in other people. So this is what happens after you've sort of evaluated your role in the process, how you're feeling, what values or expectations have been offended. This is the part where we start thinking about and really getting curious about, almost putting like a researcher hat on and getting curious about the person that we find very challenging. And so I want to introduce you to a definition from the Gallup organization, a definition for talent. And I just love, I try to squeeze this definition anywhere I can because I love it so much. But this particular definition of talent says it is naturally recurring patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that can be productively applied. So I put emphasis is mine there. Our talent can be productively applied. It can also be misapplied or underapplied or overapplied, right? It can be misapplied. So when we start thinking about the person that is a challenging person, if we'll start thinking about them with our researcher hat on, with some curiosity about what possible talent could be at play here. And I know that's very hard when like you're just really frustrated working with somebody, but I will tell you in my experience, working with organizations, again, of all sizes and scopes, that I would, if I had to guess, I'd say 90% of the interpersonal conflicts that I help kind of mediate and navigate through or coach through, I'd say 90% of them fall right here in this area of talent and tendency. Okay. So we've all got patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that can be productively applied, but may not be productively applied. So the reality is that our challenging people often, not always, but often have talent in areas that we do not. Okay. And so I'm going to ask you to fill in the blank here, like in the actual chat. If you're a chatter, I'd love you to fill in the blank. And if not, just think it in your mind. Okay. If you're thinking about your workplace and you answered the sentence, everything would be so much better around here if everybody would just, like, what is that thing that comes into your mind? Hush. Okay. I love that. Be nice, communicate directly and openly, do what I say. I love that. Listen, follow through, be open, kind of professional, do their job, right? Yeah, stay in their lane. Okay, so do you see how if everyone would be a little bit kinder? Okay, so of course you all have really unique positions you're in. Yeah, stop jumping to conclusions. I love that one. Here's the thing. Almost always what you answered, what you put in that blank is a direct reflection of talent that you have, that's an area that comes very naturally to you, or that is an extension of values that you have, right? So for example, Jen, I'm gonna use yours, like do their job, right? So if Jen, I don't know if this is true of you personally, Jen, but I imagine it is based on how you answered this, that a lot of times to a person who takes just real psychological ownership of their role and their job, and they come to work every day passionate about meeting and exceeding expectations, that of course it's going to be infuriating, very challenging if other people are not taking ownership of their roles. You know, for Michelle saying, stop jumping to conclusions, right? For that to be the first thing that comes to Michelle's mind, and this would be true of almost everybody, is certainly, and I know this is true of Michelle, right? Because she's one of the most just accepting, tolerant, and also just very strategic thinkers that I know. Yeah. That if you feel that way, if that behavior is challenging, it is often a reflection of talent that you have. So I want to give you a couple of other examples here. So I want to introduce you to Rick, the risk assessor. Okay. So Rick, the risk assessor, I use too much alliteration. I make it hard for myself to talk. But Rick is the kind of guy, he comes to every day of work wanting to protect his team from failure. He has an eye for the ways that things could get off the rails. He cares deeply about making sound decisions. He wants to move cautiously and deliberatively. He wants to ensure that his team doesn't fall victim to groupthink, right? Rick, the risk assessor, can sometimes be perceived as, critical or picky or negative, because it's an overflow of the talent that he has, right? Because he's a risk assessor. So let's say that Rick works with LeAnne the launcher. So LeAnne is a person who brings just this catalytic energy and this passion for getting things off the ground. And she has this ability to get everybody on board with an idea and to make it happen. And she's not as interested in figuring out every single detail to the plan, because she just believes that we can build the plane in the air, or the rocket ship in the air in this case, right? So LeAnne loves to just get going, and Rick wants to make sure that we move cautiously so we don't fail, right? So if you're Rick, okay, how might you perceive LeAnne? What would be, and I'd love for you to put in the chat for me, what would be some maybe phrases that you would use if you're Rick to describe what's challenging about LeAnne, right? Sometimes I hear people say impulsive. Yeah, sometimes I hear people say, they'll be like reckless, she's reckless. She moves too quickly, right? She doesn't care about this would be an, exaggeration, but yeah, she's unbridled. She doesn't care about what could go wrong. She's gonna get us in trouble. We're gonna regret moving so quickly. But if you're LeAnne, yeah, ready, fire, aim. Thanks for that, Bob. If you're LeAnne, what's frustrating to you about Rick, the risk assessor? How might you describe him? You're going to say, he just stifles creativity, right? Leilani's hair's on fire. He stifles creativity. He just slows everybody down. He's too careful. We're going to be left behind because he doesn't have every single piece of the puzzle worked out in his mind yet, right? So if you are, not visionary, absolutely. So in this case, if you're Rick or if you're Leilani, what's frustrating about this other person is a reflection of the talent that you have and the talent that they don't have that you have often, right? Here's another example. This one is a little close to home because I may or may not be a calendar Clara. So Calendar Clara is a person who brings order and structure and predictability to her workplace. She has the ability to walk into her work and to projects and create order and structure out of chaos. She values precision. She values efficient scheduling, right? And so she's the kind of person who is going to advocate for structure, predictability, and really just reducing ambiguity, right? So again, you can raise your hand if you're a calendar Clara like me, but let's say that you're calendar Clara and you work with adaptable Andrea, and Andrea is a person who brings just adaptability and this first responder mindset to her work. So she shows up every day, and the question that she's guided by is, what do people around me need from me in this moment? So I came in maybe with a plan, a loose plan, because I just know that the people around me are going to need something different from me. So I'm going to adjust the schedule. I'm going to change that meeting. I'm going to move and ebb and flow, and I'm going to help the people around me navigate challenge and chaos and change, right? But if you're calendar Clara, how are you feeling potentially about working alongside adaptable Andrea? What might you say about her, right? That she is, she's late. She doesn't care about schedule. She's not efficient. She throws us off. She's not focused. Absolutely. She doesn't seem to be taking this seriously. Yeah, I'm getting whiplash from all of her changes. Absolutely. But if you're adaptable Andrea, how might it feel for you working with calendar Clara? And again, hits a little close to home. It's good for my self-awareness. But adaptable Andrea is going to say, Clara is so rigid. She's too structured. She can handle change. She doesn't allow for any ebb or flow for just the needs of the moment. She's stressed when things go not exactly according to plan. It's very difficult, right? Sarah, thanks so much for saying this. You're a calendar Clara and your boss is adaptable Andrea. She drives me crazy, right? I love that. So it is so common that when we stop and we pause and we put on our researcher hat and we go, okay, what's going on in terms of this person's talent and how that sort of relates to my talent, that we can often find the source of so much of that challenging behavior. So yes, sometimes our challenging people don't have talent or have talent in areas that we don't, right? There are other times where our challenging people just need time to develop their talents into strength, and they need to learn how to regulate them, right? So when you think about maybe you have kiddos, or maybe you got nieces or nephews, or you've taught or worked with kids in the past, you can tell that kiddos, they've got this talent, they've got these tendencies, they've got something that they're drawn to or that excites them or energizes them. But often, because they're kiddos, it's very raw, right? They haven't learned to develop it. So for example, I have my son, Eli, is very competitive, and he's always been competitive. He's my middle kiddo. From the moment that he could sort of evaluate his own progress against the progress of other people, that really motivated him. That was fun for him. He loves games. And so that's this beautiful thing about him. He's got this natural talent there. But, when he was really little and he lost a board game, it was like the end of the world, and he's throwing like the board against the wall. And so my hope is that over time, as he gets coaching and teaching and mentorship from me, from my husband, from his teachers, from his coaches, from people who care about him, he's going to take that raw talent and develop it into something that's really productive and really helps him serve his team and his organization, his family, etc. So to illustrate this, let me give you an example. So let me introduce you. This is Elijah the empath. So Elijah is a person, for as long as he can remember, he could walk into a room and just intuitively feel what other people are feeling, right? This is maybe why he gravitated towards a career in, helping and serving and caring for people. But he rides sort of an emotional roller coaster at work every day because he's got this really strong talent in empathy. And so when he has the ability to get really high with people and to get really low with people and grieve and mourn beautifully with people, right? He's got this really, really great talent. But let's say Elijah just got promoted and now he's a manager. And so now all of a sudden, he's not only responsible, for kind of his own kind of charge and care, but now he's also having to attune himself to the emotions of all the people he's leading. And it's raw, it's hard for him. And so he's overwhelmed. And it's not just an emotional roller coaster anymore. It is every day. It feels to him like a train wreck. And so his leader keeps saying to him, you got to move on. You got to move past it. You got to stop worrying about what everybody thinks all the time. But because Elijah's talent is raw, he just hasn't had experience managing yet. He needs time to cultivate it. To his leader, that might be really frustrating. Why can't he move on from this? Why is he stressing about this? Why can't he put it behind him? Because he needs time to develop that talent that's raw into something that's really, really productive and it's not getting in the way of his success. Or how about Ivan, the idea guy? So Ivan is a guy who shows up to work and he's energized by brainstorming and ideas and thinking and coming up with new, cool ways to facilitate change and progress in his organization. But the problem with Ivan, the idea guy right now is it's so raw and undeveloped because he's a brand new leader that he is giving his team whiplash because every day he has this new $1 million idea and he's shifting priorities every day. He can't follow through on anything yet because that talent is raw. So when you're talking about a challenging person, I really like to ask, is this a situation where the person has talent that's not natural to you, or vice versa? Or is it a situation possibly where the person's talent is just underdeveloped or raw and they just really need coaching in that, or they need kind of help in that? Because most of the time, again, in my experience, about 90% of all conflicts from leader to supervisor, or from leader to employee, from employee to supervisor, and then colleagues too, falls right here in one of these two areas. Now, it doesn't capture everything, of course. It's not the talent and tendency is not the root of all challenging behavior, but it's a really good place to start digging. But you got to put your researcher hat on to do that, right? So here's a bunch of questions that you can ask yourself when you're thinking about, when you've got that curiosity hat, that researcher hat on. And it's hard to do this because your emotions are probably high when you're talking about this person. But okay, if I had to stop and pause and say, what parts of this person's job do they love? Do they gravitate towards? What activities have I seen bring them a lot of energy? Which of their natural talents is maybe at play here? What seems to be really important to them? What are their personal values? What parts of their job come least naturally and why? Where do they struggle to get the outcomes we need? And what are my theories as to why these things are a challenge? So I'm not saying you have to work your way through every single one of these questions. The point is more that you're pausing before you take action, right? You're pausing to do the work on yourself and then to get curious about the person that you're dealing with that is challenging to you. It's at that point that you can turn a corner and start doing some preventative and hopefully restorative things if stuff is, gone off the rails. But the reality is that audience analysis, this curiosity hat, this researcher hat, is the foundation of successful communication. Knowing the person that or the audience that you're talking to is the foundation of successful communication. So that's why we spent, this amount of time in this workshop focusing on ourselves and then getting curious about the other person. That then can be a springboard into skill number 3, which is communicating concrete expectations and norms for the relationship. Now, the good news here is that you can do this in a preventative way. Like, let's say you have a brand new employee coming on, you can do this in a preventative way, or you can also do this in a restorative way when things do kind of go off the rails. But Here's an interesting research stat. This is another one I share. I share this in a lot of my sessions because it's just a hill that I want to die on. It's so important that currently in the United States, and actually it's very similar globally too. Only 50% of employees say that they know what is expected of them at work. Now, when most of us hear that, we may think about just job descriptions or just roles and responsibilities, but this actually includes behavioral and communication expectations too. For example, if my boss emails me at 10 p.m. on a Friday night, does he or she expect me to email back this weekend? Is it okay for me to wait until Monday? I don't know what's expected of me. I feel maybe anxious about that. That feels like challenging behavior to me, whatever it is, right? So only 50% of employees say they know what's expected of them at work. That includes roles and responsibilities and also behavioral and communication expectations. Because of that, especially if we are leaders, we have to know that that is kind of always working against us. That role ambiguity, that unclear expectations are kind of always lurking around the corner. So we have to be preventative about it so that we can hopefully, again, prevent that challenging behavior. So to establish the tone, we need to be good and get comfortable discussing and setting concrete expectations for their role and their responsibilities and our role and our responsibilities. So imagine that you have an employee that is really giving you, some headaches about maybe they're not doing their job, maybe they are jumping to conclusions, whatever it is, that you take time to actually, and I recommend write it out. Okay, what are my concrete expectations for, again, their role, their responsibility, and then what is my role and responsibility? And I'm going to just explicitly share that with them. And again, you can do this during onboarding when you're forming teams. You can also do this in ongoing ways, and you can have those recalibration, if you will, conversations when stuff starts to get weird, right? But discuss and set concrete expectations for those. Also, what success looks like for both of you, right? What does success look like for you in your role? What does success look like for me in my role? And then these last two are the ones that are often left unchecked when it comes to communicating expectations. And that is our desired communication rhythms and our desired relationship and behavioral outcomes. I'll give you an example. I have an organization that I serve that one of their kind of core values is no gossip. Like that's just how they phrase it. And I love that because gossip is rampant in organizations and it's not good. It doesn't lead to anything positive. But that's one of their core like their core staff values is no gossip. And what I love about what they do is when they're onboarding employees, they establish the tone. They make it very clear that on our team, this is how we talk about one another. This is how we do not talk about one another. In the event that we have a problem, these are the procedures that we expect you. This is the way we expect you to handle that. Now, you may think, if you're listening to me right now, like, well, that seems common sense. That just seems like what it means to be a kind human being or whatever in the workplace. But actually, when you go above and beyond and you set the concrete expectation and you make it an aspect of your culture, that predicts adherence to that particular value, right? So it's very important that you're actually stating, these are our desired outcomes. We want employees to feel seen, heard, valued, and, respected. And so these are the ways that we expect you to behave in light of that, right? So for desired communication rhythms, KDIC, would you have an example of this? So if you're asking what I think you're asking for desired communication rhythms or relationship behavioral outcomes, this would be an example like, if I sit down with a brand new employee or an employee that maybe I've been having a challenge with, I would want to talk about, here's my expectations for how you express disagreement in a meeting with one of your teammates. Right? This is how I expect that happens. This is how I do not want that to happen. So as concretely as you can about communication rhythms, behavioral outcomes, relational outcomes. And of course, that's going to be different and unique for every one of you based on the different roles that you play and the structure of your organization. But establish the tone. When possible, seek mutual agreement and develop rules of engagement. So I know this sounds sort of silly, but one of the organizations I worked with, they were really frustrated that they did a lot of work in their Slack channels. And they were really frustrated because they felt like some of their team members were, posting like too many cat memes or something in the Slack. And I know that sounds silly, but if you're trying to, get to information you need and you're trying to be productive and you've got somebody who's, sending, funny memes or TikToks or whatever it is in the Slack channel, it can feel frustrating. And so we had a conversation, this team, about how, okay, we need to develop some rules of engagement about how we are going to communicate. And so as it turns out, we are going to make a unique Slack channel for cat memes or TikToks or whatever it is, right? And the rule is we're not going to communicate these kinds of things in this particular channel. Now, again, that may not make any sense for your organization, but the point is that we're asking questions like, how can we work together more productively? When and how are we going to communicate about projects? How will we agree to disagree? How will we handle conflict as a team? How are we going to give feedback to one another? How are we going to express frustration? How are we going to approach one another when we feel, X, Y, or Z? That's the point, is that we're developing rules of engagement. And what are we going to do when we want to look at some cat memes? So Jessica, I just saw a dedicated coffee pot Slack channel for all the fun stuff. Absolutely. Because what that does is it communicates to everybody else, like, we've got a plan for how we're going to interact with one another. So what that looks like for you and your organization, I can't tell you, of course, on this particular workshop, but what I can say is that when possible with your challenging person, try to develop rules of engagement. And let's say things have gone off the rails and you're both in a position where you're very frustrated, sitting down and asking, okay, we've obviously had some challenges and experienced some conflict. What are some ideas that you have for how we could work together more productively? Here's what I've been thinking, right? So putting on the curiosity hat, the researcher hat, and trying to get to a place of understanding rules of engagement will take you a really, really long way. And then skill number 4, when you have to have those tough performance management conversations. So this would make more sense if you are sort of the leader having the conversation with one of your employees. Don't avoid those tough performance management conversations, because what the research shows, and I will tell you my just experience working with organizations, is avoidance only just maximizes the problem like you cannot imagine. So don't avoid having those tough performance management conversations. So, okay, we're going to throw up another poll, because this one is also highly reflective of usually the strengths that you have. So which statement, and I know it's probably not perfect, is closest to how you feel when you have to navigate a challenging or awkward conversation at work, right? Where is the rock I can hide under? Okay, I know it has to be done, and it's probably going to be fine, but I'm going to panic and stress about it for days. Or, oh, I cannot wait to say everything I need to say and they need to hear. I'm not afraid of hurting their feelings one bit, right? So the way that we approach these conversations, again, is often a reflection of the unique talent that we have. Almost every person, like not almost every person, but most of the people who respond to this poll will tell me that they really struggle between number 1 and number 2, like kind of going back and forth, right? Where's the rock I can hide under? I think I'm just going to avoid it and kick the can down the road, or I'm going to just make myself sick physically and emotionally and psychologically over the next few days as I work this out. So let's go ahead and end in this poll, because you all are interesting, because your percentage is much higher in number 2 or B than most of the groups that I've worked with in the past. So that's kind of cool. But for most of us, we know that those conversations need to happen, but we also really struggle thinking about how to approach them. And so I want to share with you a couple of just my best practices for the communication side of having some of those conversations. Number 1, and I cannot overstate this, is it is crucial to the success of that conversation that you monitor your nonverbal behavior, because emotional contagion is very real. Emotional contagion is what happens when you walk into a store and you engage with a customer service representative who is just wonderfully engaging and smiling and responsive to you and actually present in the conversation, and you walk away feeling actually better, and maybe you're even smiling. In fact, research in customer service shows that customers take on the emotions of the people they engage with in less than 2 seconds. And the same is true in an organizational setting, that your nonverbal behavior as a leader in particular will reflect on the emotions of the person you're talking to within just a few seconds. So emotional contagion is real. Monitor your nonverbal behavior. Okay, this is a very big mistake that I see a lot of leaders make. And I'd be really curious to hear if this has happened to you. But when you start that performance conversation, state the goal for the conversation first, and then send the relationship building messages that you want to send. Here's why that matters. I was working with a cohort of young people managers not too long ago. And one of the assignments I gave them, because of course I did, because I assign homework, because I'm a professor at heart. And one of the assignments I gave them was to go to their team members and pretend like they were or talk to them about how they were going to have a tough performance management conversation if they were going to do that, right? So together they kind of collaboratively came up with a plan for how they might have one of those in a productive way. And it's meant to sort of just be an opportunity for them to get vulnerable with one another. And so one of the leaders came back to report on it. And he said, the weirdest thing happened. He said, I sat down and I had like my 4 team members with me. And I told them that the way I would typically open a conversation, like one of these tough performance management conversations, would be to tell them how much I appreciated them being on my team and how much I valued them and how wonderful they have been, and maybe praise or recognize them for something. And he said, all of my team members were just shaking their heads like in disgust. And he said, what? And they're like, well, either I think you're about to fire me, or why are you being disingenuous? And why wouldn't you just say what you're going to need to say? It feels inauthentic. And he was sort of taken aback by that feedback, because he said, from my perspective, I wanted them to know before we talked about the hard stuff, how much I valued them. But that's why the sequencing of our communication matters, because if we state the goal first, then the relationship building message has context. So if instead of doing that, he said, hey, so-and-so, I wanted to have this conversation with you today because, I've noticed over the last several weeks that I'm making stuff up now, shown up late a couple of times, or you've been really argumentative in meetings, or you haven't been very respectful of your teammates' time. As we have this conversation, I want you to know how much I value you and how important you are to the success of this organization. So do you hear the difference there? Because the relationship building messages, if they come after the statement of objective, there's context to it, and it feels much more authentic than if it's the other way around. So that's like a little pro tip, a little conversation hack when you're having tough performance management conversations. The next thing that you have to do in these conversations is to clearly state the problem and the impact of the problem. So just stating the problem by itself isn't enough. You also have to let the individual know, this challenging person, what's the impact of that problem. Okay. So focus on one specific thing at a time. Avoid, if possible, discussing intent or using emotionally charged words, and then be concrete and factual. So let me give you an example. If I said to my employee, one of my challenging, employees, if I said, you have been late to work, 4 out of the last 5 days, which is hopefully, is factual, hopefully, in the conversation. And then I said, it's very clear to me that you don't care about this job. Okay, that is a conversation stopper. That doesn't lead to any productive outcome because we've assumed intent. And one of the biggest mistakes that leaders make having these tough conversations is assuming intent. So instead of speaking to intent, you speak to impact, and you say, when you are late, this is the impact that it has on the team, on your reputation in the organization, right? If we focus on impact instead of intent, it completely changes the conversation. So keep that in mind. When possible and when, appropriate, coach, encourage self-reflection in those conversations, ask good questions, foster self-awareness, asking those questions about, talent and tendency and what might cause them to feel frustrated or what might be at the root of what's difficult about getting to work on time or whatever that is, right? And then finally, yes. Oh, Megan, this is also excellent advice for parenting teenagers. 100%. And then lastly here is point forward and establish concrete expectations for the future in those tough performance management conversations. So a lot of times leaders will want to sort of air their own frustrations, but they'll stop short of stating clearly what success looks like moving forward in the conversation. So here's what needs to change moving forward. Here's what success looks like. Here's your next step, right? And then any sort of, accountability that's going to be necessary moving forward, you would want to state that explicitly. I just had a conversation not too long ago with someone who had been put on a performance improvement plan and didn't realize that sort of the next step after that was termination, was just a young employee, wasn't sure, just kind of thought this was a formality, this performance improvement plan, and then felt very, very blindsided when terminated. Now, you make the argument, well, the performance didn't improve, but it really caused a major rift in terms of, in the team, in terms of, communication, because expectations weren't clear. So what does success look like moving forward? And that's the goal, is to just be as clear as you possibly can in those tough conversations. So yes, set the expectation for future accountability in the area of concern. So okay, I made it. And my problem is I am so passionate about the stuff that I would hang out here with you for another hour if I could. But I'd love to hear maybe in the chat just one or two things that you feel like you could start doing immediately as a result of what we've talked about today. Any ideas? Maybe it's your own self-awareness. Maybe it is, getting curious about the other people. Mining for talent. Thanks so much, Andrea. Maybe it's setting more concrete expectations and some of those rules of engagement. But hopefully you can take away at least one thing that you can do to start improving those challenging relationships that you have at work. So the last thing I want to show you is just, if you'd like to stay in touch, here's a way you can do that. Thank you so much for being here and for engaging with me on this kind of quirky topic. So I will pass it back over to Michelle and Janelle and Sam, and hope to see you again sometime soon.
Oh, LeAnne, that was awesome. I always love your sessions. And even though I'm in this space, I'm always learning. And I always say I'm a work in progress. So love the information that you shared. We did pop a few things in the chat. First of all, please make sure you click on the forms that Samantha shared. That is going to be really important, because that helps you enter our little contest for the giveaways. Again, we're going to be giving away a tote bag as well as a free session. You could bring LeAnne to your own organization, and we are giving that away for free. But we are asking that you help us build our brand by following our social media. And at the bottom of the form, the feedback form, there is a link to our social channels. So do that. And then I also just popped a link to a LinkedIn post. If you'd like to comment and share your feedback about LeAnne's session, we would love for you to do that as well. And I'll pop that in there again, just so you've got it. Well, thank you so much. We will hang out here for a few more minutes if anybody has any other questions. But thank you so much. And we look forward to staying in touch.
Thanks, everyone.